And we're live! Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Mishnah Mastery with a live virtual studio audience. Tonight, we are going to dive into chapters 3 and 4 of Masechet Bava Kamma. And chapter 3 especially is quite long, but hopefully we should get through everything in time. And hopefully it won't be too difficult for me to explain. Although I should preempt and say that some of these Mishnayot are quite challenging. But here we go. We're talking about damages and who takes responsibility for those damages. So what's going to happen if a man is walking through Rashut Rabbi, walking through the public domain while carrying something, and then because he's carrying something through the public domain, someone gets injured or someone breaks his items. Let's take a look at that. Chapter 3, Mishnah Aleph, Mishnah 1, Hamaniach es hakad b'rshus harabim. So guys walking through a public domain with a cud, with some kind of jug perhaps, some kind of vessel.
Yeah, we've got a Mishnah on the screen.
Oh, we were doing so well. There we go. How's that? That better? Yep, awesome. So, I need to have it on the screen. So, there's a person walking through the public domain, and he's carrying a cud. He's carrying some kind of jug, some kind of vessel. Uva acher v'niskal ba ushvara. And somebody else comes, and they stumble into this cud. They stumble into this vessel. They trip over it, and it breaks. So, someone has caused damage to the first person's vessel. So what should the halacha be? The halacha said, the Mishnah says, patur, the second guy, the guy who's tripped over and damaged this jug, is going to be exempt from paying for damages. There's a couple of reasons for this. Number one, we learn that a person doesn't usually look too carefully where they're going as they're walking through a public domain, and therefore they shouldn't have to take responsibility if someone has left something there for someone else to stumble over. And the second reason is because people don't usually put things down in the public domain like that. And so by doing so, you are creating what we learned last week, a bore. You're leaving a pit. You're leaving some kind of obstacle there for people to have to navigate. And so if they damage it, they're not going to have to pay for the damages. But crucially, if the second guy was to get hurt, if the person who tripped over was to get hurt, then the owner of the item is going to have to pay for that person's damages. So the Mishnah says, and if this person walking carefree through the public domain was to be injured on account of having bumped into your item, then the owner of this item is going to have to pay for the damage to the individual. Says the Mishnah, Nishbara kado b'rshus harabim. So he's carrying it through the public domain. Let's say he falls over and the jug breaks. So now, v'huchlak echad b'mayim. Someone comes and slips in the water that fell out of the jug. Or shelaka b'charaseha. Or he gets injured by the shards of, I guess, earthenware, let's say, if that's what the jug was made out of. But the point is you get injured by the shards of the broken jug. So the Mishnah says chayav. Then the owner of the jug is going to be liable for paying any damages. Rabbi Yehuda says that if a person just slips, then they're not going to have to pay. But miskavein chayav. If a person had acted with intent, meaning like he wants to now protect those shards, he wants to collect them up, he doesn't just like abandon it or whatever, so he's got some intention still with those shards, then chayav, then he's going to have to pay for damages if the person gets injured. But eino miskaven patur. But if not, then he's going to be patur, then he's going to be exempt from having to pay. Mishnah base, scrolling down. Hashofech mayim b'rshus harabim. So a person who's pouring water out into the public domain, which especially in the olden days, it was customary to do. You know, people might have, they wash their floor or whatever, they've collected some gross water in their house, so it would just get thrown out into the street. They didn't have a proper sewage system. Especially if it was muddy outside anyway, so your water isn't really adding anything to the texture of the ground. So if it was customary to do this, then it's interesting to know what the halacha is going to be. But says the Mishnah, Hashofech mayim b'reshus harabim, a person who pours water out into the public domain, someone gets injured on account of that, they slip up on your water, chayav b'nizkor, then the person is going to be liable to pay the damages. And that's even if people are accustomed to doing this. Hamatzniya es hakotz. Someone finds a thorn or something sharp on the floor, and in order to try and avoid people getting hurt, they pick it up and they try and put it onto a concealed part of the public domain. The es has zachuchis, or a piece of broken glass. V'hagoder es gdei roba kotzim. Or a person puts up a fence of thorns, and the fence falls into the public domain. So in all of these instances, they're trying to avoid people getting injured, but it's causing damage in the public domain. So v'husku b'hein acherim, and other people get injured on account of this action, chayav b'nizkan, then a person is going to be liable, obligated to pay for the damages. So even if a person is trying to put something into a safe place, if it's not safe enough and you cause damage on account of that, or you've erected a fence of thorns, but you've done it in your garden, it's in private property, but then it's fallen into public property, then the person is going to be chayav to pay for damages. Mishnah Gimel. Back in the day, people used to leave straw and hay in the public domain. There wasn't a problem because it would just decompose and turn into fertilizer. So the Chachamim made a takana that if you left things like this, where you're clearly abandoning it and it's not causing any real damage per se, and you leave it in the public domain, then whoever wants to can come and claim it as theirs if they want. So the Mishnah says, Hamotzi es tivno, someone who takes out their straw, the es kashor, or they take out their hay, lirshus harabim lizvalim, and they leave it in the public domain so that it just kind of turns to fertilizer. V'huzak b'hein acher, and someone else gets damaged on account of it, chayav b'nizkor, then the person is going to be liable for the damage. V'chol hakodem b'hein zachar. And also another halacha, anyone who decides that they want to take ownership of it, first come, first serve. They can come and they can take ownership of that hay, that straw, that fertilizer. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says, Kol ha'mekalkelin b'reshus harabim v'hiziko chayavin l'shalem. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says that anybody who places obstacles in the public domain and they cause damage is going to be liable to pay damage. And crucially here, it's even if a person had reshut, even if a person had permission to do such a thing, like a person who puts down hay or straw to turn into fertilizer. If you cause damage in the public domain with your things, then you're going to have to pay. And similarly, v'chol kodem b'hen zachar, and first come, first serve. Anybody who wants to come and claim those items, and that is, according to Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, it only applies when you didn't have permission to put things down. Then Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says that the person is going to have a first come, first serve right to take those things away. Finishes the Mishnah, Hahofech es hagalal b'reshus harabim. A person who sees a nice clump of dung there, they want it for fertilizer, but they want to dry out the other side. So this is a person who's spotted something in the public domain and he's turning it over so that it gets the sun and dries out and becomes better for the fertilizer. So he's indicating that he wants to use it and to take ownership of it as fertilizer. Says the Mishnah, person who turns over this clump of fertilizer, and someone else gets damaged on account of it, chayav b'nizkor. So this person that spotted it in the public domain and taken ownership of it, they are going to have to pay damages. Mishnah Daled says as follows: Shnei Kadorim, two potters, Shahayu Mahalchin Ze Achar Ze, who are walking one behind the other in the public domain. The Niskal Harishon V'Nafal, the first one slips over and falls over. The Niskal Hasheni Barishon, and the second guy then bumps into the first guy, and as a result of that, the second guy incurs damages to his pottery. Harishon Chayav B'Nizkei Sheni. So the first potter is going to be chayav for the damages resulting from the second person. So it seems quite logical, but let's see how some of this stuff develops. Mishnah Vav, Mishnah Hey. Zeba b'chavito, a person is walking through the street with a barrel. The Zeba b'korason, another person is walking through the street with a big beam, a long beam, a big 2x4, and they're coming in opposite directions. Nishbra kadosh shel zeh b'korato shel zeh patur. So if the jug breaks because it gets hit by the beam, by the 2x4, patur, then everyone's going to be exempt, especially the guy with the 2x4 is going to be exempt. They both had the right to be walking through the public domain. Neither of them have right of way. They're coming in opposite directions, and if one of them gets damaged, if the barrel gets damaged by the guy with the beam, irrelevant of the fact that the beam is longer and has a smaller surface area and can therefore cause more damage, they've both got right of way. They're coming ahead of each other. There's been damage done, but the owner of the beam, the 2x4, is not going to have to pay for the damage. But Hayabal Kara Rishon. But if the guy with the beam, the guy with the 2x4, is walking first, and in the same direction, Ubala Chavis Acharon, and the guy with the barrel is following along behind him, Nishbara Chavis Bakora, if the barrel gets broken by the beam, Patur Bal Hakora, then the owner of the beam is going to be exempt because the guy behind him should have been paying attention. But if the guy with the beam had come to a standstill quite suddenly, Bal Hakora Chayav, then the guy with the beam, with the 2x4, is going to be liable to pay for damages. But if he had called out to the guy behind him and said, whoa, careful, we have to stop, then he's going to be exempt from having to pay damages. Now, there was something that occurred to me as I was learning through this Mishnah, that it's easy to think about these cases and say, oh, well, who's walking around with beams and who's walking around with barrels? I can't say with any certainty that that this is how this Mishnah would develop and apply, but it wouldn't surprise me if, from a halachic point of view, we would evolve this Mishnah to deal with issues like people driving in cars and people braking suddenly and someone going into the back of them, and who's responsible for the damage, and does it matter if maybe you put your hazard lights on first, so that the person behind should have been aware that you were going to be coming to a stop. I feel like those kind of issues could very well be learnt out from a Mishnah like this, where the principles of what we're saying is that if you're going in the same direction and you irresponsibly cause the person behind you to bump into you, and as a result of that damage is caused, who takes responsibility? It depends on whether they've called out. It depends if they're going in the same direction, who's got right of way. These are all very relevant practical applications, perhaps, of this Mishnah. Whether we do that or not, I've never actually seen the sources inside. But anyway, where we are up to is Haya Bal Chavis Rishon Uval Kore Achon. If the owner of the barrel is walking first and the owner of the beam, the 2x4, is walking behind him, Nishbara Chavis Bakora Chayav. So the guy who's got the more prone to damage item, the beam, if he now bumps into the guy with the barrel irresponsibly, then he's going to be liable for those damages. If the guy with the barrel suddenly comes to an abrupt stop and the guy behind him doesn't realize and he plows into him with his beam, So then the guy with the beam is going to be exempt from payment. V'imamar lebal kora amad. But if the guy with the jug, with the barrel, shouts out, "Stop!" right? And then still the beam crashes into the barrel and causes damage, then chayav, the owner of the beam, is going to have to pay for it. And this would be the same case if someone was walking through the street with a lamp, with some fire, and someone else was walking through with some flax. If they came into contact with each other, and as a result of that, the merchandise gets lost because it goes up in flames, the same principles were going to apply. Are they going in the same direction? Are they going in different directions? Have they been warned to stop? Have they been responsible, negligent, etc., etc.? The same application of law is going to play out. Says the Mishnah in Mishnah Vav, Shnaim shahayu mahalchin b'shus harabim. There are two people going through the public domain. Echad ratz ve'echad mahalich. One of them is running and one of them is walking. Now, the background to this Mishnah is that people normally weren't allowed to go running in the public domain. You had to have a certain level of, I guess, decorum and sense and awareness as you're going through a public domain. But the exception would be if it was close to Shabbos. If it was close to Shabbos, then it would be socially and culturally acceptable to be running through the public domain. So you've got two people walking, and it would seem to be that it is Erev Shabbos. One of them is walking, one of them is running. Or shahayu shnehim ratzim, or both of them are running. V'hiziku zeh because of that frenzied panic, they end up injuring each other. Says the Mishnah, shneim peturim. Both of them are going to be exempt from paying for damages to the other person. And there again, if that's the explanation, that we're talking about something that's culturally acceptable or unacceptable, then it'd be interesting to see how those halachot evolve when dealing with situations like today, where it's highly normal for people to be jogging or running through public domain, and what impact then that would have on the application of Jewish law. Mishnah Zayin. Fundamentally, though, someone who is even doing a permissible activity in the public domain still has to exercise caution. Says the Mishnah Zayin, Hamavakeya b'rshus hayachid, a person who is chopping wood in his private domain, v'hizik b'rshus harabim, and something flies off and causes damage in the public domain. Or b'rshus harabim is a professional tree surgeon chopping down a tree in the public domain, v'hizik b'rshus hayachid, and something flies off and damages something in the private domain. B'rshus hayachid v'hizik b'rshus hayachid, or the gardeners around and they're chopping down a tree and a chip flies off and damages other private property. Says the Mishnah chayav, then the person who is doing that activity is going to be liable for any damage caused. Okay, this is where now it starts to get a little bit trickier for Rabbi Nick. As we enter into the world of multiple animals and multiple statuses and multiple values, this is where I tend to get lost. But Mark has got the master book, and he will help us out as we go along. So, if you've got two oxen and they do damage to each other, then you're going to have to evaluate the difference in damage. And if the animal is a tam, then the owner is going to pay half the value of that damage. And if the animal is a muad, if it's been so prone to injure and attack that it's had its status changed, then the owner is going to have to pay full compensation. So let's give this a go. Let's give an example first of all. Let's say you've got a muad which does 100 quids worth of damage and a tam which does 50 quids worth of damage. So the difference is 50. The muad has done more damage, and so the owner is going to pay the full difference between the two values. It's going to pay 50 quid. If a muad did 50 quids worth of damage and a tam did 100 quid worth of damage, then the difference is 50. But because the tam is paying more, he's only going to pay half damages. So he pays 25, even though the superfluous damage was 50. So let's see if that's made any sense And let's see if that actually plays out in the words of the Mishnah. Shnei shvarim tamim shechavlu zeh et zeh. Two tam oxen injure each other. Meshalmim bamosa chatzi nezek. So the one who's done more damage is going to pay half damages, half the value of the difference. Shnehem muadim, if both of these animals were muadim, meshalmim bamosa nezek shalim, then the one who's done more damage is going to pay the full difference of compensation. Echad tam ve'echad muad. If you've got one tam and one muad, muad batam mishalem bamosa nezek shalem. So if the muad did more damage, then the owner is going to pay the full amount of the difference. Tam b'muad, if it's the tam who did more damage than the muad, mishalem bamosa chatzi nezek, then the owner of the tam is going to pay half the amount of the difference in damages. V'chein shnei anashim shechavlu zeh bazeh. Similarly, with two people who injure each other, in an instance where it wasn't a case of self-defense or anything like that. So, mishalmim b'mosa nezek shalem. So that individual who has done more damage is going to pay the difference to the full amount. Adam b'muad umuad ba'adam. By the way, an adam will always pay full damages, and damage to humans will also always be full damages. So, adam b'muad umuad ba'adam. If you've got a person who bumps into this muad animal, and as a result they both get injured, whichever way round it is, whoever does more damage, mishalem b'mosa nezek shalim, the owner is going to pay the full difference, the full value of the difference. Adam b'tam ba'adam, if a person bumps into a tam animal, or vice versa, so adam b'tam, if the person does more damage, if more damage is done to the person, then b'shalem b'mosa nezek shalem. Then the full amount of the difference is going to be paid. Tam ba'adam, but if, where are we in the screen over here? I've not moved you down. But if more damage is done to the tam, then mishalem b'mosa chatzi nezek. Then the half value of the difference is going to be paid. So Rabbi Akiva says, Af tam shechaval ba'adam mishalem b'mosa nezek shalem. Even if the tam does damage to the person, he's going to have to pay the full cost of the difference. So Rabbi Akiva doesn't distinguish between a tam and a muad if the damage is done to another person. I think that kind of made sense. But don't worry, there's going to be harder ones. Here we go. Mishnah Tes. So how do we calculate the value of the damage? So Mishnah says, Shor shaveh maneh, shenagach shor shaveh masayim. You've got an ox worth 100 quid, which injures an ox worth 200 quid. And certainly the one that's worth 100 quid is a tam. And doesn't say whether the other ox is a muad. Okay, so let's presuppose for the moment that it's a tam. So the Mishnah says, but the einan avela yafeh klum, but the value of the carcass is not worth anything. Notel es hashor. So let's think about this. You've got an ox worth 100 quid who's done damage to an ox worth 200 quid. The difference in value is 100. The value that needs to be compensated is 100, and you can't offset anything with the value of the carcass. So the Mishnah says, "Notel es hashor." You can just take the actual animal that's worth 100 because that's how much is owed anyway. Shor shaveh masayim, shenagach shor shaveh masayim. If an ox is worth 200 and it gores an ox which is also worth 200, ve'enan avela yafeh klum, and the carcass is not worth anything. Amar Rabbi Meir says, Al zeh ne'emar, about this kind of case, it's written in Shemot, chapter 21, verse 35, Umachru es hashor hachai v'chatzu es kaspo. So they should sell the live ox and then divide up the monetary value, because each one was worth 200 quid, and so the balance is fair and square, and so you just divide up the value of that animal. Amalo Rabbi Yehuda says v'chein halacha, and though this is the halacha, it's not a fulfillment of the verse, because you must also divide the value of the carcass. So he says, Kiyamta umacharu es hashor hachai v'chatzu es kapo. You've upheld the verse that you've just quoted in verse 35, that you should sell the live animal and divide up the value. V'lo kiyamta, but you haven't fulfilled the clause in the Torah which says, V'gam es hametz yechetzun. You have to sell the, you have to divide up the dead animal as well. So says the Mishnah, Ve'ezer. So what is the case that we're talking about of 200 and 200? Says Zeh shor shaveh masayim. This is the case of an animal worth 200 quid. Shenagach shor shaveh masayim, which gores another ox which is worth 200 quid. V'hanavela yafa chamishim zuz, but the carcass is worth 50 zuz. So since the carcass is worth 50 zuz, even when it's dead, that means the damage is only 150. And because it's a tam, he only has to pay half that, which is 75. And therefore, they get half the value of both of the oxen, because the dead one is going to give each of them 25, and the live one is going to give each of them 100. So from that, the mazik, the damager, is going to get 25 back. And so that's why we have this case where the Mishnah says, Shazen notel chatzi achai v'chatzi ames. That v'zen notel chatzi achai v'chatzi ames. Each one will take half of the value from the live animal and half of the money from the dead animal. And in so doing, everybody is compensated in the right way, and everyone gets exactly what was due to them, which is my very diplomatic way of saying the maths is so hard, but you kind of get the idea. This is why I'm not a lawyer. Says the Mishnah in Mishnah Yud, Yesh chayav al maaseh shoro upatur al maaseh atzmo. There are going to be cases where a person can be liable for damage caused by the ox, but exempt from liability if he had done the action himself. And conversely, patur al maaseh shoro v'chayav al maaseh atzmo. You can sometimes be exempt from having to pay if it was your animal which did damage, and you could be obligated, liable, if it was you who did the damage. So it's going to start, the Mishnah is going to start with 3 cases where the person is exempt for their ox and chayev if they did it themselves. Says the Mishnah, Shorosh shebiesh, if your ox caused humiliation to another person. So as we'll see in later chapters, there's a price that we put on humiliation, which when a person has to pay damages gets factored in. Now, if the person causes humiliation, that's going to be a valid figure which gets included. But if the animal humiliates the person, then the owner is going to be exempt from paying for that. So shorosh shebiesh patur, v'hu shebiesh chayav. But if he caused the embarrassment, he slaps a person in public and causes him to bleed, so he's going to have to factor in humiliation for the payments that he has to make. Whereas if an animal, bumps into someone and knocks them over, then there's not going to be a payment for humiliation. Shorosh shesima es ein avdo. If an ox blinded a person's servant, v'hipil es shino, or he knocked out a tooth of a slave, patur, then you're going to be exempt from having to free the slave because the damage was caused by the animal. But if you blinded a servant, or knocked out his tooth, then chayav, then you would be liable to free them from your service. So those are our three cases where the animal will be patur and you will be chayav. On the flip side, if an ox injured, wounded one of your parents, you're going to be liable for that damage. But But if you wounded your parents, then you're going to be exempt. And that is built on the principle that if you are already chayav for something, for the avera that you've done, you can't pile on more and more punishments on top of that. So if you were to injure a parent, then really you are chayav misa. You're liable to the death penalty for wounding your parent. And if you're chayav misa for wounding your parent, you can't also be expected to pay out damages as well. So that's why your animal causing damage would make you liable, but you causing damage would make you exempt. Shoro shehidlik esagadish b'Shabbos. And if an ox accidentally or set fire to a haystack on Shabbos, chayav, then you have to pay for that. V'hu shehidlik esagadish b'Shabbos patur. Mipnei shu nischayev b'nafsho. But if you set fire to a haystack on Shabbos, you're going to be exempt from paying for it because you are going to have bigger fish to fry in that you are going to be liable to capital punishment. Mishnah Yud Aleph, which I think brings us to the end of the third chapter, is going to introduce a very important and famous principle known as Hamotzi Mechavero Alav Haraya. The person who is trying to extract payment, extract damages from a defendant, the burden of proof is on the claimant, not on the defendant. So that's a very important principle that comes up all over the place. So the Mishnah says as follows: Shor shahaya rodef achashor acher. You have an ox which is going after another ox. V'huzak, and it becomes injured. That second ox becomes injured, but you're not sure for certain if the animal caused the damage or not. So ze omer shorcha hizik. The claimant says, your ox damaged my ox. V'ze omer lochi. And the other guy says, no, he didn't. Ela basela laka. Your ox bumped into a rock. It wasn't my ox that injured it, your ox. Hamotzi mechavero alav haraya. So it's going to be the claimant's responsibility to prove that the defendant's ox did cause that damage. Hayushnaim rodfim achar echad. If there are two oxen belonging to two different people pursuing another ox, ze omer shorcha hizik. So one owner says it was your ox that damaged that ox. Ze omer shorcha hizik, and the other one says no, it was your ox that damaged that ox. Shneim puturim. Then both of those owners are going to be exempt if the injured ox owner or the owner of the injured ox cannot prove which one of them had done it. If both of the oxen were going to be owned by the same owner, then shneihen chayavin. Then the owner is going to have to pay for the damage done, because it would seem that will have definitely come from one of those oxen, in which case the owner has to pay. Says the Mishnah, echad gadol ve'echad katan. If one of the oxen were large and the other one was small, hanizak omer gadol hizik, the claimant, the victim, can say that the big ox damaged their ox. V'hamazik omer lochi ela katan hizik. Then the damager can say, or the owner of these two oxen can say, that's not the case. It was my small one which caused the damage. And therefore, if that was the case, then I'm guessing less damage is due if the smaller animal did the damage. Let's see. If the pursuing one was large and the other one was small. If the injured party says the large ox caused the damage, and he is therefore entitled to receive half the damage from the value of the large ox. There you go. But the one liable for damage says no, it was a small ox that caused the damage, and therefore it's less damage that is going to be factored into the compensation. Echad tam ve'echad muad, or you own a tam and a muad, and then the owner of the injured ox says, Hanizak Omer Muad Hizik. It was your Muad animal, which means your chayav full damages has injured my animal. Vahamazik Omer Loichi Ela Tam Hizik. And he says, no, it wasn't my Muad animal, it was my Tam animal. I only half damages. Then Hamotzi Mechavero Alavaraya. Then the owner of the injured ox has the burden of proof resting upon him to have to prove that he was right. Hayu hanizukin shnayim. If there were two victims, or if there are two animals that got injured, echad gadol v'echad katan. One was big and one was small. V'hamazikim shnayim, and the owner had two animals which caused the damage. Echad gadol ve'echad katan. One was big and one was small. Hanizak omer gadol hizik es a gadol, the katan is a katan. So then the claimant is going to want the situation to be the big one caused damage to the big one, and the small one did damage to the small one. And if that's the case, then the injured party is going to be able to make more money from the assessment. V'hamazik omer loichi. But the owner of the injuring animals says, no, that's not the case. Ela katan is a gadol. The small one caused damage to the large one, so you're only claiming damages off me from my small animal. The gadol is a katan, and my big animal caused damage to your small animal, and so that works out in the favor of the owner of the two injuring animals because of the discrepancy in value. Echad tam ve'echad muad. If one was tam and one was muad, hanizak omer muad hizik es a gadol. It was your muad which injured my large one, in which case I want to extract maximum payment. For tam es a katan, it was your tam which injured my small animal. V'hamazik omer loichi, and the mazik says, no, that's not the case. Ela tam es a gadol. It was my tam which injured your large animal, so you're only going to be getting half damages from me for your large animal. Umuad es a katan, and it was the muad which injured your small animal. But the point is that if there's a discrepancy between these claims, hamotzi mechavero alavaraya, the burden of proof is on the claimant, not on the defendant. Mazel tov, everybody, on completing chapter 3. We can move on with great discretion to chapter 4 and hopefully still make it in time for Mara if we're doing well for time. So, chapter 4, Mishnah Aleph. We're dealing with a case where a shore tam, has injured multiple different oxen. Now, we've talked briefly in last week about how if an ox repeatedly offends 3 times, then it can have the status of a muad, but that's only if there are warnings in between. So if there are no warnings, then the ox will stay in the status of a tam. And that is how we end up with a case like this. So, shor shenagach arba v'chamisha shvarim zeh achar zeh. If an ox just goes ballistic in a field and starts goring 4 or 5 other oxen that are around him, so the Mishnah says straightforwardly, which isn't straightforward at all because I get really tongue-tied in this one. Yeshalem la'acharon shebahem. So the owner of the ox which is causing the damage is going to pay the last owner, and he's going to pay half of the value because it's a tam, not a muad. So let me just try and frame this. So I think the case that we're dealing with is that this animal is goring 4 or 5 other animals, but each time the owner of that animal is taking hold of the owner of the wounded animal is taking hold of the ox that's doing the damage. So because of that, it would seem that he becomes responsible for the shore, and then he owes the money to the next guy. So let's do it like this. Reuven owns an ox. The ox injures Shimon's ox, but Shimon now grabs Reuven's ox. And then that ox goes and injures Levi's ox. So now really it's Shimon who owes the money to Levi. And then Levi's holding onto the ox, and it goes and injures Yehuda's ox. And it does this 4 or 5 times until we get to whatever, Naphtali. So Reuven has to go and pay Naphtali the value of the damages. Or at least half the value of the damages. And the loss of value gets transferred down and down throughout the chain. But, says the Mishnah, V'im yesh b'mosar, but if there's still money left over that can be paid, why would there be leftover money that can be paid? Because the maximum amount that he's going to pay is 200. Right? Because let's say all of these animals are worth 200. The maximum that the owner is going to pay is 200. So if he pays, let's say 100 to the 5th guy, and there's still some leftover money, so then some of that surplus is going to go to the guy before him. And if there's still some left over, then that money is going to go to the guy before him, and it's going to work its way back up the chain. And so the owner of the latest ox is going to gain in this situation. So the last guy is going to get the full damages, and any surplus is going to work its way back towards the beginning. Rabbi Shimon says that if the owner if Reuven is consistently taking responsibility for this animal throughout the chain, so then shor shaveh masayim, if an ox that's worth 200 quid, shenagach shor shaveh masayim, and it gores another ox which is worth 200, ve'ein hanavela yafeh klum, and the carcass is not worth anything, zen notel maneh v'zen notel maneh, so each one is going to get 100. Chazar v'nagach shor acheh shaveh masayim, if Reuven's ox now goes and injures Levi's ox, which is also worth 200. So ha'acharon notel maneh, Levi's going to get 100. V'shelafanav zenotel chamishim zuz, but Shimon's only going to get 50 zuz. V'zenotel chamishim zuz, and then Reuven is going to hold on to 50 zuz. Chazar v'nagach shor acher shaveh masayim. If Reuven's ox goes and injures another animal, goes and injures Yehuda's animal, so ha'acharon notel maneh, Yehuda's going to take 100, v'shelafanav chamishim zuz, and Levi's going to take 50, v'shnaim harishonim dinar zahav, and then Reuven and Shimon are each going to take 25. So it does make sense, but Chazara revision is the order of the day. Mishnah base. What if the shore Hamuad only injures certain species? That doesn't attack other species, it only attacks particular things. What if it then goes and injures something else? So the Mishnah says, Shor shehu muad lemino, if an ox only injures and attacks other oxes, and as a result of that has a status of muad, ve'eno muad l'she'eno mino, but you don't have to worry about it if it's in proximity to other things, or muad la'adam, or it's prone to chasing after people and attacking people, ve'eno muad labahema, but if it's in a field with other animals, then it's not going to do anything. Muad laktanim ve'eno muad lagdolim, or it's got a habit of attacking small animals, but leave it alone with a large animal, it won't do anything. So the Mishnah says, Et shehu muad lo, whichever victim it is prone to attack, mishalem nezek shalem, the owner is going to have to pay full damages. Ve'es she'eno muad lo, but that which it's not prone to attack, mishalem chatzi nezek, it's going to, the owner is only going to have to pay half damages because it hasn't built up a pattern of attacking other kinds of animals or other kinds of people, etc. Amru lifnei Rabbi Yehuda, but the Chachamim said before Rabbi Yehuda, Harei shahaya muad l'shabbatot ve'eno muad l'chol. What about a case where it only ever attacks on Shabbos, but it doesn't attack during the week? So it's got this pattern of only injuring things on Shabbos and not during the week. What happens then if it injures something during the week? So Amalahem, the Shabbasos Mishalem Nezik Shalem. So Rabbi Yehuda said back to them, well, yeah, if it injures only on Shabbos, then it's going to pay full damages on Shabbos. And Limos Hachol Mishalem Chatzei Nezik. And during the week, it's only going to pay half the value of the damages. Emasai Hu Tam, when can it reclaim its status of Tam? It's only if it can go without injuring on 3 consecutive weeks of Shabbat. So whereas we've said in other contexts, if it is able to refrain from causing damage in particular cases 3 times in a row, then it would reclaim its tam status. So here we're seeing, even if it has to wait a prolonged period of time, like 3 weeks, has to go through 3 Shabbats without causing any damage, Rabbi Yehuda says that that's when it would get its status back to normal of being a tam. Mishnah Gimel. Shor shel Yisrael. Shenagach shor shel hekdesh. An ox belonging to a Jew which gored and injured an ox belonging to hekdesh, belonging to the Beis Hamikdash. Shel hekdesh shenagach l'shor shel Yisrael. And an ox owned by the Beis Hamikdash injured the ox belonging to a Jew, the Mishnah says patur, it's going to be exempt from paying compensation. Shne'emar, as it says in Shmos chapter 21 verse 35, shor re'ehu, the damage is done to the ox of another, velo shor shel hekdesh, but not to a consecrated ox which belongs to the temple, which belongs to the Beis Hamikdash. It doesn't have a person, a re'ehu, who is an owner, and therefore there's not going to be any damages owed. This one, I'm sure, will be met with some controversy. Shor shel Yisrael shenagach l'shor shel nochri. If an ox owned by a Jew injures an ox owned by a non-Jew, then the halacha is, in the strictest sense, patur. Then the owner, the Jewish owner, is going to be exempt from having to pay any damages. V'shel nochri shenagach l'shor shel Yisrael. And if the ox is owned by a non-Jew and it injures the ox owned by a Jew, then, interestingly, bein tam, bein muad, mishalem nezik shalem. Then whether it is under the status of tam or under the status of muad, halacha is always going to expect a non-Jew to pay the full value of any damages. And that's assuming you can take this case to Beis Din in the first place. Then the non-Jew is going to have to pay the full value of the damage done. I wonder if that's there as a deterrent for non-Jewish people, perhaps. If they know that they're going to have to pay full damages, then the anti-Semites out there won't purposely set their oxen loose on Jewish oxen because the price would be too high. I wonder. I'm not sure. Mishnah Dalet. Shor shel pikeach. If an ox is owned by a fully mentally competent person, shenagach shor shel cheresh shote v'katan, but that ox injures the ox belonging to a deaf person or to a shote or to somebody who has got a mental issue of some kind, or it belongs to a minor. So ordinarily, we've seen in other areas of halacha that these people won't necessarily be subject to the same laws in equal terms to people of a competent mind. So the halacha is chayav. Nonetheless, the owner of this ox is going to have to pay those owners full. Going to have to pay them damages. But the other way around, for shel cheres shota v'katan, if the ox was owned by a deaf person or by a shota or by a minor, shenagach shor shel pikeach patur, and it injures the ox of a halachically competent person, then they are going to be exempt from liability. Shor shel cheres shota v'katan shenagach, if the ox belonging to a deaf person or to a shota or to a katan caused damage to another ox, based in ma'amidin lahen apotropos, then the based in can appoint an apotropos, which is some kind of supervisor, some kind of steward, as it translates there on the screen. Umeidin lahen bifnei apotropos, and that person then kind of assumes enough of stewardship, enough of an ownership to be able to make this animal a muad if it's constantly injuring other animals. Nispakacha cheresh. What if this deaf person regains his hearing? So it's got this. Let's say this ox now has a status of muad, and the deaf person regains his hearing. Nishtapa hashota. This shota now becomes a person who is halachically mentally competent. V'higdil katan, the katan turns bar mitzvah. So Rabbi Meir says, Chazal l'tamuto divrei Rabbi Meir. The status of this animal is automatically going to be reset to a tam. Rabbi Yossi Omer Harehu b'chezkato. Rabbi Yossi says, no, the status is going to remain until it can actively become a tam. Shor ha'itzadin, if you have an ox which has been trained to, like a bullfighter basically. So you've got a bull, an ox which is trained to fight and kill people in a stadium. Eino chayav misa, and it kills a person, it's not going to be liable to be put to death, which ordinarily, if an ox killed a person, it would be put to death. But if it's been trained to fight and to do this, then it's not going to be put to death. Shne'emar, ki yigach velo sheyagichuhu. It has to be an ox that gores a person before it is sentenced to death, and it can't be an ox which has been induced to gore. And since it's been induced to cause this damage, therefore it's not going to be subject to the death penalty. Mishnah, hey, let's try and speed up a little bit. So if the shore was to kill a person, not only would the shore be put to death, but the owner is going to have to pay a certain fine as well, known as kofer. And that is the value of the person, the value of the victim, if he was to be sold as a slave. And that comes as an atonement for the fact that the ox has killed a person. So the Mishnah says, Shor shenagach es adam v'meis. If an ox gored a person and the person died, muad, so it's going to be given the status muad. No, if it's a muad, mishalem kofer, then the owner is going to have to pay this atonement fine. The tam patur min kofer. But if the animal was still a tam, then then the owner is going to be exempt from paying this atonement fine. But in both cases, the ox is going to be put to death. V'chein babein, v'chein babas. That is whether, as well, the animal killed a male or a female. Nagach eved or ama. If it killed a slave or a maidservant, then no sen shloshim slaim. Then the owner is going to have to pay 30 selah. Whether the slave was actually worth 100 maneh, or whether the slave was only worth 25, nonetheless, there's going to be a flat rate of shloshim of 30 that has to be paid in the event that a slave or a maidservant is killed. Mishnah Vav. Shor shahaya mischakek bakosel. If you've got an ox which is just going about itself and rubbing itself and scratching itself against a wall, but as a result of that, v'nafal al ha'adam, he trips over, the animal falls over and crushes and kills a person. So an ox is only going to be killed if it intended to kill this person. So niskavein laharoges behema v'harages adam, if the animal was intending to kill another animal, but instead inadvertently kills a person, lanachri v'harages Israel, or it was chasing after a Jew, but instead it killed a non-Jew, but instead it killed a Jew, or lanafalin, it was chasing after a stillborn infant, the harag ben kayama, but instead it killed a living baby. So in all of these instances, patur, the ox is not going to be put to death because there has to have had some element of intent in what the animal was trying to achieve. Mishnah Zion. So Mishnah Zion, we're going to see that whoever the owner is, the animal is going to be killed if it kills a person. But there's a machlokes if it's ownerless. So the Mishnah says, Shor ha'isha, if it's owned by a woman. Shor ha'yisomim, it's owned by orphans. Shor ha'apotropos, it's owned by this steward. Shor ha'midbar, it's hefker, it's from the desert. Shor ha'hekdesh, it's owned by the Beis HaMikdash. Shor ha'ger, it's owned by a convert. Shemes, ve'ein lo yorshim, and this convert died and left behind no family, inheritors. Hare elu chayavim misa. Nonetheless, the animal is going to be put to death. Rabbi Yehuda says, Shor hamidbar, if it's a wild, undomesticated, whatever, ox, or Shor harekdesh, it's owned by the Beis HaMikdash, not by a person, or Shor hager shemes, or it's owned by a dead convert, so it's ownerless. Paturim min amisa, the animal can't be put to death. Lafisha ein lahem ba'alim, it doesn't have an owner. Mishnah Ches. There's two stages for the Beis Din to kill this animal. There's going to be the deliberation process, and then there's going to be the carrying out of the verdict. So once the verdict has passed, the animal becomes ownerless. So Shorshahu Yotzei Lisakel, it's been taken out to be stoned to death. So it's ownerless. V'hikdisha ba'alav, and the owner, or previous owner, comes along and says that he wants to consecrate this animal to the Beis HaMikdash. Eino Mukdash, it's not going to be consecrated because he doesn't own it. Shechato, if this animal now gets slaughtered, Basaro Asr, its flesh is going to be forbidden to be eaten, because if it's stoned, you're not allowed to benefit from the animal. But if the jury's still out, the hikdisho ba'alav, and the owner goes and consecrates it, mukdash, then the animal is going to be consecrated. And if it then gets slaughtered after it's taken out to be killed, then if the owner redeems it, then the flesh is going to be permitted. And finally, Mishnah Tes, by way of introduction, there are 4 types of shmirah which we learn about in Bava Metzia. There are 4 types of guardianship which we learn about. And the guard is going to be chayav for any damages caused. So the 4 types are a shomer chinam. He is watching this animal for free and not taking any use. I understand Mark's going to head on over here now. And he's not going to have any use of the animal while he's looking after it. A sho'el, which is somebody who is allowed to make use of the animal, but isn't going to be paid for watching over it. A noser sechar is someone who's going to be paid to watch over it, but isn't going to be using the animal at all. And a socher is someone who rents and hires the animal, so they're going to be looking after it, and they're going to be able to use it as well. So the Mishnah says, or the Mishnah is going to be dealing with how much shmirah is necessary to avoid being liable for any damages. So the Mishnah says, Masara l'shomer chinam. If this animal is given over to a guard who's looking after it for free, and he's not going to have any use. V'la shoel, and to a shoel who is not being paid, but also is going to be able to use it. L'nosei sachar, someone who's being paid and isn't going to use it. V'la socher, someone who is paying for the use of the animal. Nichnasu tachas ha'ba'alim. So if they, so nichnasu tachas abalim, they enter into an ownership status of this animal, which makes them liable instead of the owners. Muad mishalem nezek shalem. So if this animal is a muad, they're going to pay the full amount. For tam mishalem chatzei nezek, and if it's a tam, they're going to pay half the damages. Kishara ba'alov b'moseira. If the owner had tied up this animal with a rope, v'na'al b'fanav kara'ui, and or locked it in an appropriate manner, and nevertheless nonetheless it escaped and caused damage. Echad tam ve'echad muad chayav divrei Rabbi Meir. So whether it's a tam or whether it's a muad, the owner is going to be liable to pay for damages. And even by muad, it would seem, no, that's not right. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, tam chayav umuad patur. Rabbi Yehuda says a tam is going to be liable, but the muad is going to be exempt. Shneimar v'lo yishmerenu ba'alav, because the verse in the context of a muad will say that the owner has not guarded it. But v'shamu huzeh, but he has guarded it. He has taken steps to guard it, and therefore is going to be patur. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Ein lo shmira ela sakin. The only sufficient safeguarding is really slaughtering an animal, and therefore there's no degree of safeguarding that exempts an owner from liability. So three very distinct positions over there as to how far one has to go to avoid having any liability for damages caused by an animal. I'm sorry it was a longer session tonight, but Mazel Tov on completing chapter 4, and I wish you all a very good week ahead, and we'll see you all next time as we delve further into Maseches Bava Kamma. Take care.